Good morning, world. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor at Bloomberg Opinion, and I'm joined this morning by two extraordinary colleagues of mine, Andreas Kluth, who covers foreign affairs and national security for us from Washington, D.C., and Karishma Vaswani, who covers Asian Pacific politics with a special focus on China for us from Singapore. They're both smarties, and I've asked them to join us this morning to talk about what has turned out to be, I think, a pretty extraordinary summit meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, which happened yesterday, and a lot of very tangible things came out of that. And I'm going to ask them to educate the rest of us about what it all means. So let's get into that. Karishma, why now? This is the first time that Xi has held a meeting like this in 6 years. He's certainly playing very nice. One of our newsletters even called it cuddly. Cuddly is I was not an adjective I was ready to kind of deploy recently, but here we are. So tell me, why now?
Yeah, cuddly is not the kind of word you typically would associate with China's Xi Jinping, but it was a very different Xi on offer in the last 24 hours that we've seen during his visit to the US than we've seen in recent years, right, Tim? And I think the reason why now is just how much has changed in the Chinese economy, particularly in the last 12 months. Now, the last time that Xi Jinping met with Joe Biden was in Bali at the G20 last year. And when I was covering that summit, even then, the relationship was really frosty between the two, even though, it was seen as such a big and significant moment that they had actually, in fact, met. But what a difference, 12 months or so makes. We've seen the Chinese real estate sector really suffer over the last few months. We've seen unemployment figures in China effectively be abandoned because the numbers are frankly so bad. And the economy really under strain, particularly from a lack of foreign direct investment. And I think that's one of the key things here, because this was Xi Jinping's way to sort of go out into the world, particularly in front of American businesses, sit down and say, hey, you know what, guys? I know it's looking really bad from out here and what it looks like from out here, rather, but China's open for business. I'm not here to do conflict. I'm not here to make a lot of noise. I'm here to cooperate and to compete fairly, but we're open for business. And I think that's the message he was trying to send out today.
So in other words, reality and economic matters have tempered some of Xi's recent muscularity and bravado, I guess isn't a word to use because he's I think on a public stage he's always sort of a plain vanilla kind of presence, but he's certainly verbally and from a policy standpoint and in actions, this is under his regime has been an aggressive, bold China, and it's now a China that's dealing with the possibility of this multi-decade economic boom is plateauing but not going away. And is that something that you think will stay, Karishma? Is this going to be a permanent state of affairs in terms of the way he rolls?
Yeah, that's I guess, $64 billion question or whatever, the $1 million question, right? Like, will the Xi Jinping that we've seen continue to be the Xi Jinping that sticks around? And actually, I think it all centers on the sort of guardrails or the red lines that each side has set for the other. And Xi was pretty clear about what those are. Taiwan is a big one. And given that there is an election coming up, a presidential election coming up in January, it is a sacrosanct issue for the Chinese. They don't want anything to get in the way of what they see as the one China policy. I thought it was interesting that Joe Biden didn't say very much about Taiwan when he was asked during the press conference. It was a sort of one sentence line that we talked about it, and that was it. And I thought the fact that he didn't say very much was quite revealing in itself. It feels like that's an issue that they've both agreed to sort of carefully disagree on because it is so explosive. So to answer directly, what you asked, will this Xi Jinping stick around? For as long as it's convenient to Xi Jinping in China, yes. But at the point at which it doesn't become convenient, when it becomes disadvantageous, I think we will see the China that we're used to seeing under Xi Jinping, the muscular China. And don't forget, that, you're still seeing elements of that in today in any case. China hasn't stopped claiming parts of the South China Sea or all of the South China Sea. It consistently is still sending warplanes across the median straits, the median line in Taiwan. It's been accused of economic coercion just recently in a recent report. So those activities are still going on. Those actions are still going on, even as China is playing nice to the world on the global stage.
So, Andreas, in terms of playing nice, I think Biden came into this conference, into this meeting with, with open arms to a certain extent. Although, at the very end of the whole affair, he called Xi a dictator, which may just be Joe Biden going off script, as he is sometimes wont to do in these meetings. But talk in the same vein that I just, discussed with Karishma about why China was ready for this meeting. Why is the U.S. and why should the U.S. be ready for better communications with China?
The dictator slip, if it was a slip, is interesting. We can return to it. America was ready because I think everyone in Washington realized that this has become extremely dangerous. So if Karishma said that for Xi Jinping, the economy is a big thing, I think for Americans, a lot of the debates we've been having here I'm in Washington, D.C., is really about military scenarios from conventional to nuclear. And I just sort of more anecdotally to get you into this, I spent already about a month ago, the Pentagon released a number of photos and videos of maneuvers the Chinese pilots do almost every day in the international airspace over the East and South China Seas, where they really fly up like helter-skelter recklessly towards American espionage ships, airplanes, and other aircraft, and throw flares, do flips, ram it, go through the airstream. These things, because I covered in 2001, I lived in Hong Kong, I covered the spy plane incident back then. These things very easily, these are maybe 21-year-old testosterone-fueled pilots. It's not clear to which extent Xi Jinping has given them orders or even is aware of this. So and as Karishma mentioned, at the same time, it's not just Taiwan, they're bullying the Philippines, a treaty ally of the U.S., with their ships, including their naval ships. The Chinese Navy is larger now by a number of ships in the U.S., and additional marine militia, naval militia ships. They're taking over these shoals. They're surrounding Filipino ships in the neighborhood, the Coast Guard and stuff. And any moment there could be an unintentional or maybe like an escalation, a stare down. And then given that since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the former House Speaker, she's no longer House Speaker, a year ago, they completely stopped. They had a hotline and they stopped talking. And that is the most dangerous thing during the Cold War. We had a hotline to Moscow. That is so dangerous. And I think both sides, but America realized this could get out of hand. At the same time, I just want to throw in, a lot of people here are talking about America's nuclear posture. That's a geeky word for what should, because at the moment, America is bound in the last remaining bilateral treaty with Russia to about 1,500 deployed strategic warheads. China, however, has 500 and wants to get to about that number within a decade. And China simultaneously is now very cozy with Putin. Whether they're an actual alliance or the partners is not clear. And America has to think, well, are we in the future going to see them acting in concert, in which case we may have to rethink our conventional and our nuclear strategy, and that would mean an arms race. And I think that penny dropped in Beijing and in Moscow, and that's why they had a sort of low-level, mid-level talks last week about the nuclear issue, and I'm sure they brought this up too. That wasn't that they chose some low-hanging fruit, because just to get talking to them, but just to talk when there's a crisis. Let's say a pilot runs into an American plane, keep it from getting worse, and simultaneously figure out Are we going to go to war? And how do we prevent an arms race? These are big issues. And I think America very much wanted to start now before the Taiwanese election and also before the American election.
Biden has sent sort of emissaries over to China prior to this meeting who came back somewhat empty-handed. I think Janet Yellen made a visit, Secretary of the Treasury Tony Blinken made a visit, the Secretary of State Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, and there wasn't sort of an equivalent exchange on the Chinese side of high-level officials coming back in the same way. And now suddenly you come to this meeting. So I was pleasantly surprised, I guess, that this occurred and that the U.S. was willing to continue to push forward. Do you see anything else as a sort of incenting moment or triggering moment that brought this to the fore for the U.S.?
Well, for the U.S., and by the way, I think I'll let Karishma maybe weigh in, but I think for the Chinese, it's good for their guanxi, their face, that the Americans seemed to be wanting it more than the Chinese. I don't think that's even true. I think both sides realize they have to talk. There are so many other issues. There are the evergreens, not just Taiwan, but Uyghurs and Hong Kong, but there are specific, even for domestic politics, important issues. There is a fentanyl crisis, an opioid crisis, which I've called a reverse opium war. When China's century of humiliation, which she has pledged to end and reverse, started with the opium wars, and that was Britain at the time, but English-speaking people. But now as Chinese chemicals via Mexico are killing more than 70,000 Americans a year. So there are other things that are both urgent before the election campaign starts in America, and also low-hanging fruit. There are some things between them that should be easy because they don't cost either.
And we'll get into those.
Yeah.
We'll get into each one of those before we get into those now. But I was just wondering, from a broader perspective, why now for the U.S. and I hear you that there's good reasons for both sides to do that. Karishma, let's talk. Let's start to get into some of these specific issues. The one that really struck me as globally important, not that any of them aren't, but certainly there was this kind of de-escalation of military rhetoric. She said a couple things that I want to read, these are translated quotes, but he said, China has no intention to challenge the United States or unseat it. That was one of his quotes. Another was, China does not seek spheres of influence and will not fight a Cold War or a hot war with anyone. And those are, clearly, I think, to me, she has thought about a sphere of influence for China in the region. And there's been, as you've noted, a lot of concern about whether or not that becomes hot in an invasion of Taiwan. But how do you think of those statements, and how do you think of the military issues that got addressed in this meeting?
Yeah, I think, to Andreas's point earlier with regards to the number of visits that we've seen from US officials to China, I agree with you completely, Andreas. It's much better for the Chinese to feel that they're being courted consistently, and then to have this sort of grand finale with Xi Jinping going to the United States. I think that works in China's favor, and I think the US was really clever to keep going, actually, regardless of the fact that it may not have had a sort of similar reciprocity, although you did see the foreign minister from China go to the United States ahead of Xi Jinping's visit. But to what Xi actually said, this is really conciliatory language from the Chinese leader when he says that, China doesn't want that sphere of influence, that it doesn't want a hot war or a cold war. This is meant to sort of signal to the outside world that China's willing to play ball on a global stage and be that sort of peaceful, rising giant that, to be fair to Beijing, it consistently says this at every single international forum, from Davos to the United Nations. This is sort of Xi Jinping's line when he goes out into the global arena, so to speak. But it's particularly significant in an environment where he's addressing American people, because it's not been lost on the Chinese that the impression of China and what it means as a threat to the US has consistently been rising amongst Americans. And the fact that, the perception of China as a hostile force consistently comes up in surveys like the Pew Research report, where a large number of Americans are seeing China as a threat. That's something that would have been fed back to Beijing, to Xi Jinping by his advisors. And that doesn't make for good business. You're in a situation where your key market thinks of you as a threat, and they don't need that. So I think with that in mind, that was very much why Xi Jinping is making these sorts of noises. And it goes back to, you've got to match the words with the actions. And, until I start to see a reduction in the number of warplanes flying over Taiwan, and the sort of incursions in the South China Sea, or the clashes with the Philippine Coast Guard in the South China Sea, then I will believe the fact that China doesn't want this sphere of influence. Right now in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, it is very clear that Beijing still wants that influence. But I think the sort of image that he's representing, Xi Jinping is representing to the US, is right here, right now, we're here to cooperate. And I think that's what he was trying to say.
Right. If China doesn't want to suggest that it's trying to build a sphere of influence in the region, it could stop building islands in the South China Sea, for example. Yeah. Andreas, how did you read his statements on sort of military de-escalation, if we can call it that?
Xi Jinping's statements.
Yes.
I like hearing him say that, because it suggests, as Karishma said, he's been briefed, that it suggests both sides are trying to understand how the other sees it. I found it hypocritical. In the South China Sea, from their point of view, as with Taiwan, that is a Chinese sea. Within the so-called 9-dash line, it's a ridiculous historical map going back to the Republic of China. It is international waters. From their point of view, that would allow him to say, I'm not a hypocrite, those are our waters. But you see, it is hypocritical, and it has long been known that the Chinese strategy, is to push the US Navy out of the first island chain beyond that. And that is, I don't know what it would be if it's not a sphere of influence thinking. And I think similar things are happening from the Arctic, which they don't even have an Arctic coast, but they think they're a player in the Arctic and around.
They refer to themselves as an Arctic nation, actually, as our colleague Liam Denning has pointed out. Yeah.
And so you can analyze that. And then we have things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an infrastructure and debt peonage policy by Xi personally, where it's clear that they're trying to, for instance, be a large player in Africa and have allies in their camp. Now, you can view this in different ways, but the behavior seems to be suggests sphere of influence motivations. As you guys in a beautiful podcast said, from their point of view, he might want to feel, or the Chinese might want to feel accepted. You can see how they might feel encircled and contained, as in Cold War containment, by us, when we just yesterday, or just at the same summit, we hugged Indonesia more closely. We have a Quad, we have AUKUS, we have lots with Australia and India.
Close relationships with South Korea and Japan, which also has to be threatening to China.
We're being incredibly friendly and supportive to everyone around China, and that looks to them like sphere of influence, whereas we would say we're trying to preserve the open international rules-based order, that mouthful. But so we're both a little bit hypocritical, which is why I'm so glad that they're talking again, because in this tense context where everyone is like, are you lying? Or are you telling me, do you mean it? Or you not mean it?
Can I really trust you?
A bunch of tweets from reporter there, like somebody asked Xi, do you trust Biden? And Xi apparently took his earbuds out and just didn't answer. And later someone asked Biden.
He was thinking to himself, I trust him as long as he doesn't call me a dictator in public.
Well, and then the dictator thing. And so was that planned or was that not planned?
I would gamble on not planned.
Yeah,
but I don't
I
know.
would 100% say not planned. He didn't even have to answer, to
He's
be
a
honest.
pro. He's been doing this for a while.
Yeah,
I
he
observed
knows.
him at the Munich Security Conference once when he was a VP, and you get this. It's like when after the interview, journalists know this. You walk into the elevator and they go on, and that's when the most interesting thing of the whole conversation happens. So it's sort of like he could have easily sat that one out. He didn't. So, you know, I got your number. That's sort of how I feel.
Karishma, I recently had the pleasure of your company at a conference we attended together in Singapore. And one of the centerpieces of that conference was a discussion with John Kerry, Biden's special envoy on climate, a former Secretary of State. I interviewed him at the conference, and we spoke about whether or not Xi and Biden would get anything meaningful on climate out of this meeting. And he was optimistic. He wouldn't be specific. You know, I specifically asked him about whether or not China would up the ante to the loss and damage fund, meant to, you know, refund essentially states in the global south who've been hurt by climate change produced by the industrial powers of the north. He didn't get into that or anything else, but he said he was optimistic. And we got a little bit of an optimistic development out of this one, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think the commitment to work together in this way on climate, particularly on renewable energy, is really significant. And all of the military and national security stuff aside, right? This is the most pressing, urgent issue that is facing the planet today. And you know, whether you're in the United States or you're in China or Indonesia, anywhere really, this is the most important thing that is facing our world today. And I think it was great that these two big superpowers could put aside their differences to some extent and actually come to the table and cooperate on an issue like this. And that's exactly what the world needed to see. So, you know, to be frank, I was really glad that they took this mature step and decided to, you know, maybe not go all the way. I would have liked to see more on fossil fuels, for example, but certainly more than I was expecting. And I think it is also important to point out that actually, in and of itself, China's very, you know, it's put as a high priority the environment and climate change in its own country. It's a key aspect of development for the Chinese state. So it is in keeping with what the Chinese want to see in their own country that they're trying to ensure is happening on an international level.
As always with China, there's these contradictions. So, you know, they're the world's biggest EV battery maker. They're also continuing to build new coal-fired fuel plants, which are, you know, one of the major emitters of fossil fuel and a cause of climate change. So I always feel left in personally in something of a cloud in trying to understand what their real goals and motivations are. But how did you think about the climate piece of this, Andreas?
The news, such as it was about cooperation and Chinese efforts to reduce methane and to increase renewable energies, came out the day before. I don't recall Biden then making a big deal or really any deal at all about it in his statements, which suggests there wasn't much to highlight from his point of view. He chose simpler, and I would agree. I mean, I think Biden in general was trying to offer him in the 4 hours that they talked he was making an offer of joint custodianship instead of Cold War, and joint custodianship comes with joint responsibility. That involves things like avoiding nuclear arms races, but also doing what they can for climate change, because China is the largest and US is the second largest, but historically US is the largest emitters. So if they don't do it,
and the U.S. is still the biggest of greenhouse gas emissions.
I Googled it. I thought it was China, but today I thought China had passed it. But historically, it's like the U.S. is by far, in a way, the most important in terms of the stuff that's already out there. In any way, if they need to solve this together, because something like the European Union, they can have green policies, they will not move the needle if these two don't do it. Yeah. But there wasn't much. But you see, this is why it's good that they start talking, because now they can get the lower and middle level, not the other bureaucracies will meet, and maybe they can come up with something one day like a climate club. It's sort of economic model of something like that. if they wanted to think out of the box. And the wonderful thing about all these issues, because the list is so long and we haven't even mentioned all of them, is if you make progress in one, and that's why fentanyl is a simple one, it costs you nothing to crack down, then that builds trust in the other. And then eventually you can say, okay, now let's talk about nuclear weapons. I think climate change and nuclear are equal importance, because they could bring all of us down together.
And Karishma, we've walked right up to, the front door of an old-fashioned trade war between China and the U.S. The U.S. is really, the CHIPS Act was a very tangible demonstration of the U.S. getting serious about not letting, what I guess, for lack of a better word, military grade and more sophisticated chipsets from getting into Chinese hands.
Yeah.
And that's caused much consternation in China. But there's been rumblings about other crackdowns on other forms of trade, other products and industries. What's your view of what's come out of this around trade relations?
Well, on trade relations, I felt that it was, on the whole, pretty positive in the sense that nothing further came out that would have affected China in a negative way. I don't think they could have done that at this meeting in any case, because that would have been, sort of a red line for the Chinese, and they would have probably been briefed well in advance that this is what, this is how much we're going to say. And I think the line from the US, which has consistently been one where we want to cooperate and compete as long as it's fair, and that we will keep pushing for market access, for instance, and free and fair treatment of American companies in China, that has consistently been the position from Washington, and I don't think the Chinese would have been surprised to hear that. I thought that the dialogue around artificial intelligence was really interesting, because even just last week, Tim, when you were sitting down at that panel on artificial intelligence, where all of these issues sort of come up about the kinds of ownership that is involved when it comes to this technology. Regulation is going to be a key factor going ahead. It's going to change so much of how we do business and interact with each other, that again, to sort of not oversimplify things, but the fact that these two superpower economies, who are, whether you like it or not, going to be the leaders in this technology in the future, are sitting down to talk about this is critical, because it helps to have dialogue on this, rather than this kind of splinter net of two technologies that are operating in different parts of the world, which effectively is what the US-China trade war did, right, to some extent, with regards to key and critical technology infrastructure, like Huawei, for instance, no longer being able to sell its products in many parts of the world. And that meant that then countries who used Huawei technology, the Chinese tech giants' technology, had to find other products and change supply chains. All of that is really expensive and cumbersome, and there have been, legitimate national security concerns over companies like Huawei and others in China. But sitting down and having a discussion about artificial intelligence, a dialogue like that, is really positive, I think, for the future.
Andreas, you've gestured at fentanyl, but it's a couple of times, and it's an important thing to land on before we run out of time, because it's, I think, symbolically important. There's been, China has been the largest purveyor of fentanyl into the U.S. market. It's become a major social issue in the United States with addictions. It's one of the things that has been used, I think, to vilify China as sort of this drug dealer holding American consumers captive through addiction. Of course, the U.S. could get its own house in order in terms of dealing with why we end up with big segments of our population who become addicted. In any event, China has vowed in this meeting to crack down on the export of fentanyl. And do you also take that at face value?
I do, although Biden said trust but verify, which is, I believe, a Ronald Reagan phrase from a successful detente with Gorbachev in those days. But trust but verify, but I think he can, because why? It costs him nothing. It even Chinese people apparently are having problems with addiction. This is not going to determine the outcome of the world, but it is very big, because remember, we haven't really gone into it, because there is an American election coming up, and this fentanyl issue intersects with the southern border, because the fentanyl, the chemicals go go to the Mexican drug cartels who mix them to create the fentanyl, then smuggled it into the US, and the money goes back via Chinese money launderers, often using the wildlife trade. When I read in, I mean, it gets very exotic. So there are a number of crime and other problems. And of course, uh, you're aware that the Republican presidential candidates are sort of vying with one another in being tough on Mexico and threatening to bomb Mexico, so we could create other problems. If we get a grip on this fentanyl trade, which is 50 times more potent than heroin, and the equivalent of 2 grains of salt hidden in heroin or something kills. And so people don't, and 70,000 plus Americans a year saved is a lot. If we can get a grip on this, we've done a huge amount and can build on it. And that would be great. It also for the upcoming election season, both for Xi and for Biden, they can use that, because the other thing we haven't mentioned is Xi might want to do as much as possible now, because a little bit over a year from now, he might be sitting across from Donald Trump.
Yeah. Really
well, we'll certainly have discussions about that if that happens. We're going to move towards wrapping up. I want to ask you both to put your thinking caps on about how you think about things going forward. What would be meaningful next steps, Karishma, in the wake of this meeting to sort of solidify some of the at least nascent gains we've seen here, and to keep moving things forward? What are you keeping your eye on?
Yeah, so in terms of sort of political events, the Taiwan election is a game changer for me. I think this week what we've seen with the opposition parties uniting, that could end up posing to be quite a threat to the DPP's candidate, the candidate that China doesn't want in power in Taiwan. And if indeed the opposition parties, by uniting, end up in the president's seat, that is an outcome for China that would be quite palatable. So I think that would take the tension and the heat off U.S.-Taiwan-China relations. So that's something I'm watching really closely, because it could go the other way as well. The other thing that I think has been key coming out of the meeting, and that I'm hopeful to see more action on going forward, is people-to-people exchanges. You know, in the speech that Xi Jinping made amongst the business execs earlier today, late last night, rather, I should say, he talked about the fact that flights are resuming, thousands more students and people. He was hoping to see exchanges between the US and China. I can't emphasize enough how important that is for people to understand each other. And, you know, I think I've said this to you before, right, Tim? There's no getting away from the fact that China is a rising power. It's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. It's in our interests to understand it and to get to know it better. Our political systems don't match China's, and China's don't match ours, but that doesn't mean we can just ignore it or consistently, hate it and hope that this problem goes away. That's not going to fix things. So the more people that end up going to China and find out more about the country, and vice versa from China to the United States, the better I think it is for all of us in terms of our understanding of both places.
And that in the brightest of circumstances, maybe we can learn a thing or two from one another. Andreas, how about you? What are you looking for going forward?
I agree completely with Karishma, and to avoid duplication, I would, in addition, like to see China could, and they don't have to announce this for us journalists every time they do it, but China could constructively work with the US in the background to manage 3 difficult people. That would also prove that they mean it about not wanting spheres of influence. They have influence with Russia, and Xi Jinping should keep making sure that he doesn't escalate in Ukraine or elsewhere. He has influence with Iran, whose oil he's buying. We've sanctioned it. And he has influence with the mullahs. He should keep them from escalating in that conflict. And he has presumably some influence, although it's ambiguous, with North Korea, more than us, certainly. And that would, if you think back to what I said a few minutes ago about joint custodianship, which I think is the American offer, that would show that they mean it.